So majorly, we'll talk about what serverless computing is and what is Azure Functions. We'll try and create an Azure function, and then we'll call the function, okay, which, using a trigger, right, and see if it executes fine. So this is a conceptual session as well as a demo session, right? So what you need to create an Azure function is a Microsoft account, right? And then using that Microsoft account, you need to sign up for Azure, right? So typically when you sign up to Azure for the first time, you get a $200 credit, right? Which is active for about 1 month. You can use it, and after that it'll expire, right? So that is the basic prerequisite that's needed to create Azure functions, right? So Azure functions comes under something called as serverless computing. So we need to understand what is serverless computing first in order to make in order to get to know Azure functions well, right? So there are different ways to host um, software or backend to all your mechanisms. So there are multiple ways to do it, right? So one could be on premises, right, which is the first one here, in which you take care of everything. So whatever is in violet or purple, that as a company you're taking care of, and whatever is in green is not your problem. It's not your worry, right? Somebody else will take care of it for you, right? So on premises, everything starting from storage, servers, networking, OS, applications, updating them, everything is on your bucket, right? You need to take care of everything. Infrastructure as a service is one level higher, where the infrastructure is given by some other provider, right? But only you need to take care of certain things after you get the infrastructure. Say, for example, on that infrastructure, would you want to install, Ubuntu or Microsoft Windows, or things like that. Starting from there, applications, functions, runtime files, all those things you have to install and manage. So that is one level better than on premises, but it still involves a lot of work from your side. You need to have a separate IT team with people who can handle this, right? Only then you can do with the infrastructure as a service. Then comes platform as a service, where you only have to worry about the applications, right? So the OS and the middleware and runtime files are given for you, right? Then comes serverless, where you don't have to worry about the server and anything at all. You just have to worry only about the business logic, which is the functions, right? That you are writing and calling, which is just the thing that you are creating for processing any workload and stuff like that. So that comes into functions, right? It is very specific to your company, for your team, and for what you are trying to accomplish. That is the only piece you have to worry about. In fact, you don't even have to worry about what I have to install Python. No, it'll be installed for you, right? And you can choose which version of Python you want to use, right? So everything is managed for you. You just write your Python code and then run it, right? So that is serverless. So serverless does not mean there's no server. You don't have to worry about the server. That's all, right? So then comes software as a service, right? Where the functions are not there because it is a provided package, right? So say, for example, Gmail or anything else. So you can't do much there. It is provided to you, and whatever functionality it has, you can use it. You don't need to worry about anything else. So that is software as a service, which does not have functions, but everything else is there, right? So this is typically the difference, and this is where serverless comes in, right? So it is basically on cloud. You can provision it and start using it, within a matter of seconds, right? You can start creating workflows. Now, Azure Function is one of the applications that fall under serverless computing, right? So what it does is it responds to events. Okay, it could be any type of event. It could be a HTTP call that it receives. It could be a time-based trigger. Every time, every day at this time it will run. It could be a event, right, which could be a message being added to a service bus, or it could be any trigger, right? So there are like specific types of triggers. Say, for example, some rows have changed on a SQL table. That could be a trigger, right? So for these triggers, it will respond, right? So it will monitor these, it will monitor these areas where you have defined a trigger, and if a change happens there, it will respond by running that piece of code which you have written, right? And that piece of code can be in any language. It could be in C#, Python, Node.js, JavaScript, any language, right? And then it'll process that information, whatever it is written to do, it'll process it, and then it can give outputs to certain third-party applications or to other applications within the Azure domain, or it could be any other third party which even you have created at your end. It could be an API, anything of that sort. So the whole idea of Azure Functions is it responds to events and it runs the code and gives you the output. That's the concept behind Azure Functions, right? So I'll now show you 3 examples of where Azure Functions can be used, right? So you have the first one is a web app, right? So somebody makes a request on a web app. They're using the web app on browser. They're clicking some button or something like that, right? So then a request is being queued to a service bus, right? So once there comes a request into the service bus, it will trigger the function and it will do some processing and it saves the information to a Cosmos DB, which is a database, a relational database. So say, for example, somebody is placing an order, right, on one of the web apps. They have added few items to the cart and placed an order. So it'll take that request, it'll process it and store those rows into a SQL DB. It's an example, right? So then there is a mobile app, right? So which will make a HTTP call, right? And it'll be processed by a function, and it'll add some rows to a DB. There is a trigger for the DB. If something changes on a table in the DB, it'll trigger another function, and that can do something else, and so on and so on. It'll be a chain, right? So this is an example of a mobile app, right? Where if you try to log in into Gmail app on your phone, it happens like this. It may not necessarily use Azure Functions, but it happens like this. It will send a HTTP request, then it will take it and process it, and that will trigger something else, that will trigger something else. And finally, the response would be, it'll, come back to your client, which is your phone, and then it'll sign you in, right? Just stuff like that. So this is an example of mobile API. Now, these both are not very relevant for us because we are not software developers, but this thing is, it could be an example for us, right? So say for example, there comes a new file into a blob storage, which is a cloud container of sorts, right? Like a folder of sorts. There's a new file that comes there. It's a PDF file. So that triggers a function. So that function takes that PDF file, it decompresses it, and then sends it to a model, right? Which is a OCR detection model. It can scan text and it can scan images and convert it into text, right? So that model runs and then it stores the information into a DB, right? So as and when new files are being added to a location, they are being processed and the information is being stored inside a DB in a structured format, image to text is what is happening here, right? So this could be an example, right? Typically, we can also use Azure Functions for all our ETL and data processing stuff, right? Which can be run on schedule or which needs to happen as and when a file is placed, etc. Say, for example, for one of the recent dashboards which we have worked on for a client. So there was a case where we had to process CSV files as and when they are put into a specific location. That needs to be processed and the information has to be added to Snowflake, and from Snowflake it'll show up on the Tableau dashboard, right? So the moment they place a file into a location, all this has to happen, right? And at the end of the whole processing sequence, the dashboard should be updated and it should start showing the new files, new information from the new file, right? So it could be done using Azure Functions, right? That's an example. Right. Any questions up until now before we move further? Okay, straightforward, right? So moving on. So now we'll just skip this part. I think I explained it. It's basically called as function as a service because that is the only one that is, you're taking care of, right? So everything else is same. Right? So Azure Functions, right? The most interesting thing here is you can code in the language of your choice. You are not restricted, right? Point number one. And point number two is it is scalable, because you're not managing the infrastructure or the server, it is scalable, right? So let us say a lot of people call the same function at the same time, or there's a lot of load on that function. then the cloud provider will scale their capability, which is the resources, automatically, and it will execute and finish successfully. But you'll be charged for the amount, for which they have deployed the resources to handle the incoming request, right? So it is scalable. It is charged only for the resources used. Right? The most interesting thing is this: you can code in any language. You're not restricted, right? So like I said, it is event driven. It could respond to a HTTP request or a cron trigger, meaning it's a periodically scheduled thing, right? Or a blob trigger. Sorry, my bad. It's a blob trigger, which is place a file into a location and that triggers something. There's a lot more as well, but these are the three most common ones. The most common one is HTTP request. That is the one that is used in all mobile apps and web apps and all of those things. Now these are stateless. Stateless meaning they are not dependent upon the previous run or for any other piece of code that ran some time ago or that will run in the future. It is independent. They are created and destroyed on demand. Whenever the trigger is done, this function is run and then it is all cleared again. So it is stateless. It doesn't depend on anything else, right? By default, and this is the important thing, by default, it has a timeout of 5 minutes. So the code that you run on Azure Functions cannot run for more than 5 minutes by default if you don't change the timing of it, right? You can change it to a max of 10 minutes, right? That because it is typically designed for very quick, small things that needs to happen in real time. It's not a big batch processing task that can happen, in hours together. It's not designed for it, right? So typically it is mostly used for APIs, phone applications, and web applications. All of those, how much time, will you give for a web app to respond to your request? You click on a button, you expect it to respond immediately, right? So that is the thing it was designed for, right? But it can do up to 10 minutes, right? So we can process reasonably big task with a larger compute size. It can come under 10 minutes and more or less it can be done, right? Except for very huge ones, which cannot be done on cloud, right? So if your code runs for more than 10 minutes, you have to host it on a VM and then, run the Azure function locally. That's possible, right? So you, instead of calling a cloud, so if it's a HTTP request, right, you have to call the URL on which the function is hosted, Azure function is hosted. Instead of calling a URL that's there on the web, you can call a URL that's there on the local host, right? Like you have a SQL server running locally and or a Jupyter notebook running locally on your system. You type localhost slash, some 8888 something, right? It'll open up the Jupyter notebook. That's a URL that is local. Likewise, you can host the Azure functions locally on a virtual machine or on a laptop, and you can, use the trigger and set it up. And there is no time limit for you. It can run for even 2 hours together. But the problem is if you want it to be on cloud and if you want everybody to run it, then this becomes a problem, right? It can, if there's no dependency for anybody else to run, but it's a, scheduled task that happens every day at this time, then you can do it on a VM or on any of the systems or on multiple systems. In fact, check if it is run on other system and then, not run it here. All that is possible. So there's also one more service that's called durable functions, right? Which is slightly advanced than Azure functions. There is no time limit on it, but it is charged differently, right? And it has the ability to monitor. So basically, it is a stateful function. It's not stateless. It can depend on something else happening and then some other function to run. And if the output is good enough for this function to run, it will run. All that can happen. It is stateful, right? So it is charged differently, like I said, and it has no timeout. The most important thing about running an Azure function that you have to be mindful of for the clients is the execution frequency. Because you are charged for the resources that you use. If you call it very frequently a lot of times, right? So then the associated cost will increase. Or if you use a lot of compute resources, then the associated cost will increase, right? So the good thing is Azure function gives you some amount of executions and space for free first, right? It gives you 1 million executions free, right? So it will definitely come under our requirements if you're running some job every day, right? You can run probably, 300,000 jobs a day for a month. It will still not cross 1 million. So it'll give you a sense as to what it is designed for. It's designed for, like I said, HTTP request on, web apps and mobiles. There it'll easily cross 1 million, right? That's why they have set that bar, right? But we are using it for a slightly different purpose, and it can be used for this, right? So while you're planning to use Azure functions, you have to be really calculative about how much time I'll call the function and how much it's going to cost me. So there's a whole lot of things that come associated with running the function. The files that you need to run the function need to be stored. So that will occupy storage space, right? In a blob storage, and that will be charged as per the blob storage rules or pricing terms, right? There is a compute resource, right, that you'll be using, which comes under this 400 GB per second, right? If it goes above, you'll be charged separately, right? For read operations and for write operations, the charge is different. It'll be charged separately according to that. So how many times you write really affects your total cost. Write cost is higher than read cost and stuff like that. So there are like a lot of things that go into the total pricing of your whole solution that is hosted on Azure Functions, right? Cool. So that is pretty much what I had on conceptual side. Any questions before I show you how to create one and how to trigger one? All right. Okay, cool. So let's get to code. So I've opened Visual Studio Code, right? I've installed a few plugins here. And I've signed into my Azure account. It's a pay-as-you-go subscription, meaning it's not free. The free is done for, right? So here, if you click on Azure Apps, you don't have any app inside it as of now. So I'll create one, right? So before you create one, first you will create it locally on your system, and then you will create a resource for holding that app on the Azure portal, right? And then you will deploy the file from your local into the newly created resource on Azure portal. So this is the 3 steps. Create a function locally, create a function resource on the Azure portal, deploy the function to the Azure portal, right? So the 3 steps to have a function ready, up and running. This is it. Once it is up and running, you can trigger the function and it will execute, right? So first, let me take up. So I have a folder here. It's called Azure Functions, right? I'll use this folder, right? So I'll go ahead and create a function, right? I'll use this Azure Functions folder. It's in my downloads, right? It's asking for the language to use. I'll use Python. So the model V2 is the latest published Python model that is published from Azure side. We'll use that. It's asking me to create a virtual environment if I want to. I'll skip this because I'm not going to import any packages specifically for this demo. So I don't need to create a virtual environment which holds a lot of packages. I'll skip this. It's asking me for a trigger. Should it respond to a HTTP call? Should it respond to a change or new file being added or a file being modified on a blob storage? Should it be a SQLDB trigger or a event grid trigger or a queue trigger, meaning a new request being added to a queue, or a service bus, or a timer trigger? Timer is every day, same time. I'll do with HTTP trigger for now, right? I'll name it something, name the function. Okay, func HTTP trigger. So who can call the function? If it's anonymous, anybody with the link can call that link and it'll run the function. If it's function, then the person who's calling the function has to give a code as a parameter. So it's the same URL, but with a query parameter that says code is equal to this value. So anybody who has the code can run the function here. If it's admin, they have to give a key, right? Which is a password of sorts, right? I'll go with anonymous for now. So it's creating a file, right? So if you go to that folder and see Azure Functions, it has made all these files. It was empty before, it has made all these files now, right? So this function app.py is the code that will host your function for now, right? So based on the parameters we specified, it has written this template for us, which we can modify, right? So the function name is func HTTP trigger, right? It's an anonymous level function, right? It runs on a HTTP request trigger, right? So that's so this is the template. Now what it does is it does something which is not very important for us. I'll just tell you what it does. It sees if the HTTP call that came and invoked the function has a parameter called name. If it has a name, it prints hello name. This HTTP triggered function executed successfully. If it does not have a name, it prints this HTTP triggered function executed successfully. Pass a name in the query string or in the request body for a personalized response. That's what it does. If it is not there in the if the name is not there in the parameters, it searches the body to get the name for it. If it's not there in both, then it does this. Right. So this is it's a hello world function of sorts. Right. It's pretty basic. So now we have created a function. I'll just do some slight changes to know this is our function. So I'll do a is equal to 2 plus 3 square. Let's do into 2. All right. So I'll just print this along with the name, right? Right. So now if I call the function using a HTTP request and I pass the name as a query parameter, then it will print this. Say, for example, I say Sinna, hello Sinna, the HTTP triggered function is executed successfully. The value of 2 plus 3 into 2 is so-and-so, 10, whatever, right? So let's see if it runs that. I first save this function. And so now that we have created a function locally, it's there in this file, right? It's there in this file. I need to get it to the portal, right? Azure portal. And for that, I have to create a function on the portal first, right? So here, so this is the portal. You go home. This is the portal, Microsoft Azure portal, in which if we go into function, there's nothing there inside. It's blank, right? I can create a function up here, or I can also do it from VS Code using the plugins that I installed, right? You know, this is typically easy than doing it there. So I'm used to doing it here, right? So right click on a function, create a function app in Azure, right? It asks me for a name and it's a global name. The name has to be unique, right? So there should be no other function in the world on this name. Let me do some funky thing. So let's do, so it's a function app that we're creating. So I'll do the app, HTTP trigger. So now, hopefully it's not there. Right, it's not there. It's asking which version of Python to use, right? It's asking for a resource group, which I've already created. A resource group just has the compute, storage, everything bundled up in one place. So you can assign a resource group to any app. So it will start using that resource group. It's for easy management, right? I've made a resource group test Azure, right? I'll use that. It's asking for a hosting plan. So there is a consumption plan, premium plan, app service plan. The lowest cost one is consumption. I'll go with that. The premium one has a pre-warmed storage. It's always ready for you to act. The consumption one is not very ready. After it triggers, it'll take few seconds and then it'll respond. So if latency is a problem for you, you have to go for the premium one and the other ones. It's asking for a storage account to where it has to store the code. So once this code has to be uploaded to portal, right, it has to occupy a specific space on storage in cloud. So I've made a storage account for it. It's called storage st test Azure, right? I'll select that account. Even if you don't have it, you can just click on create and give the names. It'll make it for you. It's easier, right? So application insights is a resource that you can use to monitor your app running. I've already made a resource for it. I'll use that app test Sinna. That's it. So once you give all these things, you can also skip the application resource, the insight one. It's now making the function. Basically, once it makes a function, it will start showing up here, right? So that means it is a function is created, but there's no code inside it. The code is still on our system. I have to deploy that code to that function, right? So let it create. It's created, right? Now, how do you ensure it's created? You click on this function app. It will start showing the app name, app HTTP trigger Sinna, right? It's created, but inside it, there's nothing. Inside function, there's no function inside it. See, it's blank. It's blank. There's no function, right? So once you deploy the function that you have written here to this app, then it will start showing up on the portal. But if you come here to a refresh, so this is created app HTTP triggers in now, right? So open it. Let's look at app files. There are no app files, right? There's only host.json. There's nothing else. There are no files here. Right? So let's deploy the code that we wrote. So this piece of code, which is inside the function app.py along with the local settings, requirements, all those need to be deployed to the app. Let's do that. So I'll do this, deploy function to app. So I have only one app on my account in which I have signed in. So it's showing me that name directly. If I have multiple, I have to choose, right? Are you sure you want to deploy to this app? It will overwrite any previous deployment and cannot be undone. Sure, let's deploy it. So this is just a sample function which I've not done much, but you can do whatever. It's basically Python code, right? You can, whatever can be done in Python, if you can write it in a Python script, it can be written here and executed here, right? It's now deployed, right? So let's go here and refresh the page. So say, for example, you want to connect to an API, get data, right? And then publish it to Snowflake, right? Which is a use case we have already done, right? And you can host that use case inside this place, right? And then whenever the function is called, it'll run that piece of code and it'll give you the output, whatever. If you want to see some outputs, how many rows were added to Snowflake. So, what details about that rows added, etc. you want to see, it can be done. So it's basically any Python code right now. So let's go to app files. So you have a lot of these app files now here, right? So function app, if you open, a is equal to 2 plus 3 into 2, and that is, it will come here. So this function got deployed to the portal, right? So now if I have to trigger it, right? So let's get the URL for it. It's a HTTP trigger, so there should be a URL for it, right? So I'll copy the function URL, right? I can do file, place it. I'll do this. It got triggered. I didn't pass any name on the URL, right? So the standard response got triggered, right? So if I pass a name, oh, sorry, I did an and by mistake. So now it's running that piece of code which says the value of 2 plus 3 into 2 is 10, right? So it depends on, you just call that function and whatever it is supposed to do based on the parameters you specify, it can take a different route, logic route, it can do different things, and then it'll complete executing. So this is just a very simple function because we just wanted to print something on screen, but instead it can fetch data, process data, store data, everything can be done, and that is a separate session because that is what is the capability of Python and how you want to do it, right? This is just, so what is Azure function and what can be done using this. So that's why I didn't do any of that, right? I just printed stuff that is there. So if you want to change something here, you can change it and then you can redeploy it. So just do a redeploy, it'll update the code there. The next time you call a function, it'll give you the new output, right? So that's pretty much what Azure functions can do. Any questions? I can take it up.
So now this is serverless, right? So why did we have to create the source, the compute resource or anything like that?
You're giving Azure the permission to create space, compute space, the permission to create storage space, etc. So if you want to limit the spaces, you say for this app or for this use case, I just want you to use a maximum of 5 GB space for storage and probably a 16 GB RAM or something like that. You can define it inside a resource group, right? So then it will scale up until that. Right? So all this is, you are giving permission and telling what is the levels you can use for this app to Azure, and within that levels it will operate.
It's like an upper limit.
Yeah, it's an upper limit or a lower limit. You can set up all these inside the resource groups. Basically, it's a range. You can give a range and it will operate within that. And you can also use it for your monitoring. So if you have a lot of apps running, you can see which one is costing you more. So which resource group is being used more, and then you can accordingly adjust the resources and bring your cloud spending within the budget. All that can be done.
And each function, does it need a separate function app or one function app that you created, right? The app triggers and that can hold multiple functions.
One function can hold only one. One app can hold only one function.
Okay.
Right, but it can do a lot of different things. So the same function can be triggered using HTTP, using time bound, right? So if I just go here and then probably do this, create a function, I'll do a timer trigger, right? Append timer trigger function to file. Name of the function, I can do the same function here, func HTTP trigger. If I put that here, it'll add up. So here, this is a section, right? It'll add up a new section below that says @app root is equal to, and then here the definition, it'll change from func.http request to timer trigger respective function. And when this function is called, if it is called using HTTP trigger, it'll run this piece of code. If not, it'll run that piece of code.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Understood. So based on the trigger, it'll run to
So you can just create a small definition of a function here and then use that function definition inside both the triggers. So irrespective of what trigger it uses, it'll run the same function. It's possible. And this is a very useful case because every day at 9 o'clock, it'll run the pipeline automatically and the data will be updated on Tableau Cloud. And if at all something changed during the day and they want it to reflect and they don't want to wait till the next day, they can just call a HTTP URL, just click on it and it will start the pipeline, and in a few minutes it'll be done and it will start reflecting on the dashboards. All right, so that's what I had.